kind of thinking. Those with anxious. So cognitively speaking, conspiracy theories belief also involves an exaggerated or distorted use of two very common and important strategies that we use all the time. Very likely there is none. We can also see forms of cognitive bias, like motivated reasoning at work, and this is a thing that we can all fall victim to, so to speak. Socially speaking, according to Jan Willem van Prooijen, belief in conspiracy theories seems to increase during moments of perceived societal crisis. This is even more true for people in communities in which the raw material, the precursors for conspiracy thinking is already present. So to understand these precursors and some of these hedonic factors, these factors of pleasure and attraction, again, Michael Barkin terms a super conspiracy because it is comprised of a cluster of event and systemic conspiracies. Though it has direct and indirect predecessors, it doesn't come out of nowhere. QAnon began on October 28, 2017, on an image board site called 4chan. There, an anonymous user claimed to have Q-level clearance, which is a U.S. Department of Energy authorization that allows access to top secret data. A series of cryptic happened. This is the official first drop. Now, it was originally on 4chan, so it didn't look like that. This is how it often circulates to people in the QAnon community. From October 28, 2017 to December 7th, 2020, Q posted 4,953 drops full of riddles, questions, ciphers, images, and URLs to news articles and videos. Wealthy elites has orchestrated over the centuries a shadow war against the common people, constructing in nearly every major country a deep state that operates in secret behind the facades of our current political, financial, and media institutions. These powerful conspirators, known as the Globalist Cabal, run this deep state and thus the world's major political, financial, and media institutions. The Cabal includes ranking members of both Democrat and Republican parties, elected officials, including nearly every U.S. president, the theory goes, except JFK, Reagan, and Donald Trump. It includes A-list Hollywood celebrities, major musicians and artists, and international billionaires. The working pedophiles, who for decades, some argue centuries, have trafficked, tortured, murdered, and molested children. They have supposedly done this to fulfill their satanic rites and to harvest a biological compound known as adrenochrome, a dangerous addictive substance believed to prolong youth and health. Again, all in quotation marks, people. The conspiratorial plot is the creation of a new world order that will allow the Cabal to institute a totalitarian one-world government they alone will control. In fulfillment of this plot, the Cabal and the deep state has caused nearly every world crisis of the 20th century, every war, invasion, genocide, famine, economic disaster. Globally, they have conspiracy theory alleges that the Cabal manufactured the COVID-19 pandemic, instituted economy-killing lockdowns, and created a fake COVID-19 vaccine designed as either biological surveillance or a forced fertility measure, or even the creation of mutated humans as part of a depopulation effort. This Cabal, acting as the deep state, also rigged the 2020 presidential election to assure that Trump would not get a second term. The removal of Donald Trump is important to this conspiracy theory. In early 2020, so the thinking goes, Trump was chosen by the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. military to run for president because he was the only powerful figure with no ties to the Cabal, and therefore he and the military could bring those conspirators to justice and end forever the deep state, the Cabal, and its evil doing. Again, wild speculation. This destruction of the deep state and the returning of power to the people would bring about a series of mass arrests and even public executions of these politicians, celebrities, and billionaires. These events, which Q alluded to in his first post, which never came to pass, came to be known as the Storm. And it would lead to a great awakening in which the American people and the world would no longer be ruled by the globalist cabal. Okay, I know what you're thinking. How on earth can this be enjoyable? How is it enjoyable to believe this? For many believers, those with both weak and strong belief commitments, QAnon taps into spiritual and political precursors, specifically ideas, arguments, images, and rumors that many of them have previously encountered in their spiritual or political communities. For example, QAnon promises a great awakening, a vanquishing of cosmic evil. It has apocalyptic overtones and portrays Trump as a quasi-messianic figure. Q repeatedly cites Ephesians 6:10 through 18, beginning at 11. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. QAnon influencers frequently talk about using spiritual discernment to make sense of Q's messages. For more hardline believers, Judaism and Catholicism are fronts for the Luciferian cult. In other words, QAnon evokes images and rhetoric that can be attractive to some forms, but not all forms, of conservative evangelical Christianity. But QAnon is not just attractive to certain forms of Christianity. Those with neo-pagan or New Age spiritual beliefs, who would often lean left on social issues, have found in QAnon a populist rhetoric that pits the common people against the elites, a rhetoric suspicious of big pharma in relation to COVID-19 and vaccines, as well as rumors and imagery that resonate with previous conspiracy theories that were sometimes attractive to people in the so-called New Age movement or neo-pagans, like reptilian shapeshifters. In fact, in 2020, QAnon beliefs spread among yoga practitioners on Instagram. So QAnon throws into stark relief aspects of the world that believers feel they could not understand previously. QAnon's political precursors are numerous. The idea of Democrats and establishment Republicans as, at best, elites not to be trusted, or worse, members of an evil cult, resonate with some more extreme holistic pedophiles who worship Satan. Like a warped branch, QAnon can be easily grafted on the existing tree of political demonization, a demonization that has been going on for decades. So the arousal of these rhetorical and imagistic precursors is not, of course, a guarantee that one's going to tumble down the rabbit hole. People make choices. But with our contemporary media bubbles, our highly partisan news sources, and numerous platforms of user-generated content, it's easy for us to craft, in the words of political scientist Jody Dean, quote, competing conceptions of the real, new versions of consensus reality. Long before Facebook whistleblower Frances Hogan came forward, media studies scholar Siva Vaidyanathan demonstrated that social media algorithms are designed to amplify messages that receive strong reactions, lots of likes, and strong interaction. All too often, this means amplifying the messages of outrage and negative feelings. And it only adds to the problem when politicians, media figures, or news sources, like Fox News, echo QAnon rhetoric with talk of a deep state, or unfounded allegations of George Soros funding the replacement of white Americans with South American immigrants. But QAnon is also what I call an affective community. And here I'm merging media studies scholar Zizi Papacharysi's idea of affective publics with medieval historian Barbara Rosenwein's idea of emotional communities. And I use this hybrid concept to describe the interpretive practices of the QAnon community and how they kindle again and again feelings of curiosity, intrigue, mistrust, and wonder. But let me be clear. The discourse of QAnon can be incredibly violent. It's common for members to cheer on the idea of publicly executing Hillary Clinton and others. They have praised military coups in Myanmar and wish they had happened here. They regularly spread anti-Semitic bigotry, and I see over and again still on Twitter people calling for armed insurrection fight against even vaccine clinics. But it's also a welcoming space for believers to share information, interpretations, and engagement. They call themselves Anons, to imply that they, anonymous, just like Q, are not necessarily that removed from Q. They also call themselves digital soldiers, borrowing a phrase from an infamous speech given by General Mike Flynn, who was a very famous QAnon amplifier, at a Young Americans for Freedom conference in 2016. Whenever an Anon is losing faith, often after one of Q's numerous predictions have failed to happen, other Anons rally around them by repeating a number of Q slogans like "Trust the plan," "Nothing can stop what is coming." If they're very upset about what's happening in the news, the media is the virus. And where we go one, we go all. These feelings of curiosity, intrigue, and wonder are most apparent in the elaborative, interpretive demonstrations that believers perform on Q drops, photographs, tweets, and newspaper headlines as they search to find out how the plan is run. So the Anon turns to a kind of numerological investigation in which repeated numbers and timestamps are believed to index previous Q drops. Again, this image circulated to suggest that the storm, these mass arrests and public executions, were just about to happen. This technique is very common, very famous. The goal of these interpretive demonstrations is not to arrive at ultimate answers, but to keep the process of interpretation going. It is, in the words of Mike Fenster, a manic will to seek rather than to know. A Q drop will require more deciphering, which will potentially change one's understanding of previous interpretations. Meaning is endlessly open then. Revelation and insight are emergent and progressive, never stable. To be part in a world of intrigue, to live inside a real-life spy novel. This is part of the enjoyment of QAnon meaning-making. QAnon, like any spiritual or political community, offers a sense of being connected to something greater than the self. Anons will frequently post messages voicing how proud they are to be chosen, to be part of the most significant moment in history. In multiple drops, Q posted YouTube links to songs, as if to motivate or inspire Anons. Repeatedly, Anons would leave messages on YouTube, and you can still find them, that say over and over again, "Q sent me here," followed by near rapturous expressions of awe, as if the URL were a personal invitation to each of them. To believers, QAnon is a spiritual and political movement that promises followers a front row seat to history, and it does this in part by engaging them in a collaborative, interpretive practice. Rituals, almost, that foster feelings of curiosity, intrigue, yes, mistrust, but also awe. And it is those shared feelings that allow believers to form an effective community, one seemingly at odds with the rest of the world, sometimes causing great strife between families. This is part of their allure. So to close, I'll say, if we want to do something about the influence of conspiracy theories on political life, and as someone who spends a lot of time in these online spaces, I think we do want to do something. To do it, we need to understand the thoughts and the feelings that are drawing people in, that keep them coming, that keep them engaged, and keep them circulating this information. Thank you. All of my photos come from Shutterstock, but this is an image of a protest August 10th, 2020 in Bucharest, Romania. QAnon is very much a world phenomenon now. I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, there is a crossover. So some of, I think, there's really interesting work that was done with conspiracy theories at, around what was called the Satanic Panic, if you remember that. The idea in the 80s that there were basically a lot of devil worship, Satan worship, and all of these people were having these false memories that they had been sort of a part of this ritual abuse. Well, some of the best research about that, I mean, it was absolutely horrible. Google it, look at stuff about the Satanic Panic. People went to jail. These memories, false memories, are extremely powerful, right? And so people were in a hypnosis. These kids were made to believe or feel that this ritual abuse, often harsh ritual abuse, happened. It did not. But some of the best research on it came from people in folklore who were interested in how it spread. I think a lot of what happens now with conspiracy theories, because of online venues, they spread like rumor. So I think we need to return to rumor as a way to understand these. Rumor is also interesting because we understand rumor as having a kind of societal or social benefit, right? It can be a secret kind of knowledge. Sometimes rumor can be very helpful to us. So there is an overlap, at least in like folklore studies. There's a lot of really interesting work too that looks at how certain forms of urban legend don't always rise to the level of these massive conspiracies, but they can be both, they can offer a certain kind of protection, right, a sort of political protection. Sometimes the advice can be good, but other times it can be used again for really nefarious purposes. Thank you.
How do conspiracy theories affect people who work in the news and the media?
Oh, yeah. Most news companies now have reporters that work specifically on disinformation and sort of online disinformation. I say mainstream media. That's no criticism of alternative news sites. I just mean like literally. What they do is they spend most of their time looking and tracking these things. So a lot of the best research right now that we have about conspiracy theories comes from journalists. Only because they're on the grounds, they're looking, and their barriers for publication aren't the same kind of thing that like we academics have to go through, right? It can be tough for reporters who follow this, though. These reporters frequently get doxxed, they get death threats. They go to these online spaces. As reporters, they're often quite public about who they are because they do interact, right? So it can be very, very dangerous for them. There's also a huge online community on Twitter and other social media sites where you can see the journalists that study both disinformation, online disinformation, and conspiracy theories. It's also a really supportive environment. Like, I'm just sort of a fly on the wall, not a real journalist. I mean, not a journalist at all, right? I'm a very boring academic. But it is also a space where they've created sort of support for each other. One of my arguments is that we actually need more of that. Every single news agency in this country should hire journalists and experts that focus specifically on conspiracy theories. Because it is not uncommon for politicians and public figures to echo these things, knowingly or unknowingly, and people need to be asked about it. You know, the way the journalists will be like, hey, you keep saying that. Ron Paul frequently will tweet and talk about a deep state, and it's confounding to me. He probably doesn't believe in, a Luciferian cult of, cannibalistic infanticide, but to keep talking about a deep state, the more that gets circulated, the more it feeds into the idea that the periphery of this conspiracy theory is true, and if that's true, what else is true?
view about this, say in academia?
Oh, yeah, yeah. So this is like total plant, right? So I do want to give a shout out talking about these journalists. This is already a wildly busy area of like research, right? So the one by Will Sommer, these are all journalists and other kinds of researchers. In the middle, they're researchers, right? Rothschild and Sommer are journalists. Summers is not out yet, but Rothschild's is probably the best book about it for me. I do think Pastels and Pedophiles is really good, but Rothschild is the one that sort of looks at a broader view. There's a lot that we can do. Deplatforming works. So there was a time when I could go on Twitter, and if I knew the right Twitter now, I'm not talking about like these like darker spaces, I'm just talking about regular old Twitter. And if I had the right hashtags, I could be flooded with this. The community was very easy to find. YouTube, one of the biggest spreaders was YouTube, in part, again, because of that algorithm, right? I'd click on something, and then I'd be 3 clicks away from a QAnon video. Just like click, click, boom, there it is, with nearly anything. And so deplatforming works for extremist voices. It's like whack-a-mole, they come back. I'm still on Twitter. Most of the work I get, most of the community that I follow is on Twitter because I'm interested in what is hanging out at the surface, what's the easiest to find with the lowest barrier, right? So deplatforming works. We need to hold social media companies accountable. We also need to hold news corporations accountable for disinformation, for the way they may knowingly spread some of this. Again, I think there should be journalists and experts that are hired. We also need those journalists because we need to hold politicians accountable. Like, I'm a scholar of rhetoric, right? So I understand that using certain kinds of discourse can be really powerful for your community, right? So politicians do it all the time. But echoing and amplifying strategically QAnon rhetoric can be extremely dangerous again. I can create a little media bubble for myself, in which the more I hear this, the more true it feels. And then if I had elected officials, if I have news agencies repeating this, it only adds to it. We ourselves, I think we all need to know a lot more about how conspiracy theories and disinformation works, period. Part of my interest in this is really, in many ways, a kind of public education function, right? This is everywhere. This is actually dividing families. We need to know much more about this. I also think we need to be careful about our online behavior, right? Like the stuff about social media and outrage is real, right? Social media is kind of like an affect engine. It gets us revving, often gets us outraged, and then we post and we share and we post and we share. I knew people that I don't think believe in QAnon just posting QAnon echoing memes, and I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, in the messages, do you know what this is? It is very popular right now on Instagram. So, and it's very popular on TikTok. On TikTok, it's in this genre of TikTok, this like, whoa, isn't this weird? And there'll be people with things and they're doing the little pointing and they're like, you can see, isn't this weird? And it's just, it's recycling old QAnon stories. And so that's one of the things that we have to be careful about. I also think we have to educate ourselves. It isn't helpful to say that everybody who voted for Donald Trump is a conspiracy theorist. It's inaccurate and it's not helpful. So we have a problem with political demonization in this country. What Abramovich calls negative partisanship. We often don't vote for our team, we vote against the other team because we hate them so much. And if we're not careful, it leads to a lot of sort of demagogic rhetoric on our side. And so when we spread these things about, oh, the people believing in this are just idiots, they're all idiots, they're all uneducated, it's just not true. I guarantee you, every one of you probably believes at least one low-grade conspiracy theory. And I know this because there's been 2 big social science studies that have found that it's often the case in large educated populations. Now, they're low-grade, right? It's not Luciferian cults or cosmic war or anything like that. But I really think thinking about how we ourselves use this, and I'm not making excuses. This QAnon believers can be incredibly violent. We have seen, if you haven't, you should Google, you have seen what happens at school board meetings now. Many of the people who go to school board meetings and are angry about mask mandates, look, that, whatever, that's one thing. But when you get up there and you start echoing again the idea of this is producing transhumans, it's population control, it's to create a one world order. You then are echoing these sentiments that someone, and all you're doing is giving someone else evidence that it's true. And so, make no mistake, I am not saying, like, oh, it's no big deal. January 6th, January schmicks, it was no big deal. On the contrary.
Are there ways we can use invitational rhetoric to kind of interact with people that maybe online, maybe in person that we're really close to, like family and friends?
Yeah, yes. So I taught a class last fall in rhetoric, propaganda, conspiracy theories, and at the end of the class I was like, we'll talk about what we can do. I had to start talking about what we can do in week 3 because all the students kept wanting to have office hours to talk about it. I take this really seriously because I think we all know and love someone who is on the periphery of this belief. They may not admit it. Psychologists, there's a lot of great information online, but one of the things that we know is that the internet and COVID-19, the lockdowns, right? And I think we needed to quarantine, I'm all for that, right? But what it meant is it put a lot of people who didn't interact, they couldn't interact with people face to face as much now, and now they're interacting online, and they're finding all of this, right? So one of the things that psychologists say is we have to engage with the people that we love, and we have to find ways to engage with them. It's okay to say, I don't think we're going to agree on that. I don't want to talk about that. But if someone is open, so debunking, we all know that debunking isn't the greatest way to do it, right? I got the facts, and I'm going to give you the facts. People double down often, and social psychologists have demonstrated that. But be curious, right? Ask them questions. Help them understand. I've known people at early, I'm raised in Georgia. This is where this accent comes from. Like, I've heard stuff about a new world order on the periphery of the religious communities I've been on since I was a kid, right? It was going to be barcodes. It was going to be this other stuff, the mark of the beast. I've heard those things, right? And my thing is not to dismiss or to criticize evangelical Christianity at all, but to say that we can hear these things. And I think one of the best things to do is, if the person is open, engage them with some questions. Have a kind of dialogue. Don't go into that dialogue going, okay, here's the 5 ways I'm going to tell them they're dumb. But just ask them, why would Bill Gates do that in a vaccine? Why would we want to get rid of 1/3 of the world population? Like, why would we want to do this? So it's just pulling at the threads. Try to create doubt is what you're doing. But also you have to find other ways to connect with them. Many of the people who are the strongest believers, have the strongest belief commitment in QAnon, have been very alienated from their families. Now, I get it, right? But that means that is their community. It's okay, though, to try to pull those threads, to keep talking, find other ways to relate to them, find other things that you have in common that you love to talk about. But if you need to step away, it's okay to step away. Or it's okay to say, we can't talk about that. this is one of those things we're not going to be able to talk about. It's not easy. There's like literally a lot of information by psychologists now online because of this.
Yeah, so you talked about like how social media stuff like YouTube, Twitter, stuff like that, like are a reason for these things because they just like have your bubble where they keep feeding you stuff that you've liked previously. So like, how would you get social media companies to change that? Because that's like keeping people on their website with ad money and stuff.
Yeah, right. So we've discovered, recently that there is financial incentives to do this, to ad revenue, right? So ad revenue can be a great way for Google and others to get money, and it can be on a really horrible site, right? So one of the things that helped with deplatforming and culling, let's say, culling is a very bad metaphor, I don't mean it like that, but cutting down on what was happening in Twitter, though it's still there, right, is banning hashtags. That sounds really silly, right? But right now it's very hard to do like hashtag QAnon. Nothing comes up often on Twitter. Hashtag, what is it, WW, God, I'm bad with initials. Where we go one, we go all, right? Hashtag that, almost nothing comes up. Now there's just like hashtag 17, right? Because Q is the 17th letter of the alphabet. So there's always ways around it. But that requires membership in the community to know about those secret codes, right? So if we can figure out ways to just narrow the gate a little bit, right? Narrow the gate of entry so that people aren't just accidentally finding this stuff. Twitter was quite successful in the way it did it, banning and clamping down on hashtags and things like that. It made a really big difference. Instagram and TikTok, you can just go QAnon and they'll just pop up because they kind of don't care. I mean, that's terrible to say, but they haven't gotten the spotlight, right? YouTube was one of the worst. YouTube was the place where you can find it the most. Now there's I shouldn't even say it. Now there are alternative sites where you can find these other tube channels, right? And all of the anons who had these channels that they were paid for. Another problem with this is that people make money off this. There are people whose livelihood is to be a QAnon commentator. And they are very wealthy. I mean, I would say wealthy. We're not talking Bill Gates money, right? But they're living some nice lives on people paying for this content. So there are these venues that are allowing them to do this, right? So this is the kind of pressure you put on them. Do you know that one of the people on your platform on April whatever was advocating the overthrow of the government? They were advocating executing Fauci, which Steve Bannon sort of did jokingly, right? Didn't affect whatever platform he was on. He's still there doing his thing, right? So I think it's about narrowing the pathway of entry. But deplatforming, banning hashtags, it can really work. But it gets recycled. Now TikTok, there's some great journalists looking just at TikTok. There were old stories that circulated about like, what was it, Wayfair selling expensive cabinets that were really children. You can find it now on TikTok again. It's from like, I think 2 years ago. TikTok brought it back because the people in charge of TikTok just aren't paying attention to any of this at all. Thank you. That's a good question.
Do you have any predictions on the state of QAnon in the coming decades?
So I planned this slide because some of what I have to say is very depressing. This is our new political reality, full stop, period. These beliefs, these things, these ideas will be echoed and amplified in each election cycle until we do something about it. So, I don't think this is going away. This is one of the things I really think is important for us to think about, periphery versus core, right? I don't see someone running for president on the platform of getting rid of a Luciferian death cult that goes all the way back to the cult of Baal, right? I just don't see that happening. And I say it sort of ridiculously, but I don't see it happening. But deep state, rigged elections, these things are just echoes. They're on the periphery. These new world orders, that discourse is happening. It will continue to happen. It is politics as we know it right now. So that's why I'm like, what do we do? I don't know. It sucks. Like it's bleak. Like it's bleak. Like there is a part of me that's like, we have to do some of these. We have to do some of these, because this is not going away. It is easy to find politicians who repeat these messages over and over again. Many CPAC speakers, one in particular, was 2021, was accused of being a QAnoner, and they sort of brushed it off and said, well, any allegations about children should be looked into. Any allegations about children? The idea that they're harvesting adrenochrome, which you can buy online, and it really doesn't have, so I mean, adrenochrome has like no effect, right? Like it doesn't do the things they think it does. Like, so this is not going away. And we, I think, all have to be more knowledgeable about its sort of insidiousness. That's always depressing way to end, right? Somebody's always like, well, where's like the hope, Kenny? I'm like, it's there, there's some, right? Like, it's where. All right, well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate you coming out. Thank you.